They proclaimed that District 18 was inviolable, a bastion where law enforcement badges served as permission for undue violence, where crucial evidence mysteriously disappeared at their beck and call, and where even magistrates deferred to the unscrupulous demands of corrupt officers. For 2 decades, they have refined their illicit enterprise, each wrongful apprehension meticulously planned, every kickback scrupulously recorded, each eyewitness forcibly silenced, until they took Eleanor Davis into custody. They perceive her as a 78-year-old retired educator, a defenseless target, simply another African-American woman to browbeat in their affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. Their intent was to process her within 24 hours and consign the incident to oblivion. Instead, they inadvertently provided her with an unobstructed view of their entire venal empire, encompassing every dialogue, every scheme, every transgression. What they failed to grasp was that Eleanor Davis had instilled in generations of pupils the importance of challenging inequity. Now, with her son, the United States Attorney General, poised to receive an imminent phone call, she is about to impart upon these officers the most arduous lesson of their lives. On occasion, the most perilous observer is the one whose scrutiny is underestimated. Just before we proceed, I'm curious to know your location of viewing today. And should you be relishing these narratives, ensure your subscription remains active, as tomorrow's featured segment is one you assuredly won't want to forego. The dimming sunlight of the late afternoon painted elongated shadows across the immaculate aisles of Thompson's Market, an exclusive retail establishment nestled in the nucleus of Oakwood Heights. Eleanor Davis delicately rearranged her strand of pearls, a retirement present from her erstwhile students, as she meticulously scrutinized the newly harvested produce. At 78 years of age, she comported herself with the identical stateliness that had commanded reverence in her classroom for exceeding 4 decades. The store's bright fluorescent lights reflected off the well-maintained floors, forging an almost clinical ambience that complemented the carefully selected clientele that frequented the venue. Eleanor took note of the furtive glances from other patrons, yet dismissed them from consideration. After all, she had resided in the city for a duration surpassing that of most of their existence. Officers Brad Mitchell and Kyle Harris positioned themselves near the establishment's entry, their presence projecting intimidation rather than reassurance. Mitchell, a burly figure with closely cropped blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, lightly nudged his colleague as Eleanor navigated between the aisles. "Behold her," Mitchell whispered, his tone subdued but edged with certain disdain. "She is an anomaly here." Harris, younger and keenly desirous of demonstrating his worth, aligned his posture. "Shall we investigate?" They advanced toward Eleanor as she examined a cluster of organically grown bananas, their footfalls purposefully resounding upon the tiled surface. Eleanor elevated her gaze, her demeanor composed despite the sudden augmentation of tension within her shoulders. "Ma'am." Mitchell's articulation bore that deceptive courtesy that had perennially grated on Eleanor's nerves. "We've received several grievances pertaining to suspicious conduct within the store." Eleanor gently set the bananas down, her movements measured and deliberate. "I am merely shopping, officer. I have dwelled in this municipality for over half a century." "Indeed?" Harris's skepticism saturated every vocalization. "And do you frequently patronize this particular establishment?" "I frequent any locale that suits my requirements, young man," Eleanor retorted, her pedagogical inflections surfacing naturally. "This market carries specific provisions that I necessitate for my Sunday repast." The store's manager, Thomas Parker, a man whose meticulously pressed attire could not conceal his palpable unease, approached the ensemble, his gaze shifting between the officers and Eleanor, evidently having reached a resolution regarding whose allegiance to offer. "She's been ambling through the aisle for nearly an hour," Parker ventured, notwithstanding that Eleanor had arrived a scant 20 minutes prior. Several clientele have conveyed apprehension. Eleanor's grip intensified upon her handbag strap. "That is patently untrue. I have only recently arrived, and I possess my parking meter receipt as substantiation." Mitchell advanced closer, encroaching upon Eleanor's personal perimeter. "Permit me to view your identification, ma'am." As Eleanor reached for her purse, Mitchell abruptly grasped her arm. The force of his hold caused her to falter backward, and before she could regain her equilibrium, he propelled her forward. Eleanor collided heavily against a display of meticulously arranged oranges, scattering them across the floor. "Cease resisting," Mitchell bellowed, despite Eleanor having made no attempt to move save to cushion her descent. "I am not," Eleanor began, but Harris was already securing her arms behind her back, the restraints cutting into her wrists. Near the checkout area, a young African-American gentleman named Jordan Carter had activated his mobile device, capturing the entirety of the incident. His extremities trembled with indignation, yet he maintained a camera's stability, archiving each instant of the injustice transpiring before him. Mitchell discerned his presence and disengaged from Eleanor, charging toward Jordan. Erase that recording immediately. "I am cognizant of my rights," Jordan initiated, but Mitchell seized his mobile device, contorting his arm until Jordan's digits relinquished their grasp. "Eliminate it, or you'll be joining her downtown," Mitchell menaced, thrusting the device back into Jordan's grasp and observing as a youth, his shoulders stooped into feet, expunged the proof. Eleanor observed this exchange through eyes that had witnessed an overabundance of analogous scenarios throughout her lifetime. She retained her composed demeanor, even as Harris crudely assisted her to her feet, even as other patrons feigned obliviousness, even as the manager commenced directing his subordinates to collect the strewn produce, as though that constituted the true tragedy. "I desire to confer with your supervisor," Eleanor stated audibly, her vocalization resounding throughout the now silent store. Mitchell emitted a boisterous guffaw, the sound harsh and dissonant. "Madam, you'll be fortunate if we refrain from appending assaulting an officer to your charges." They shepherded her through the establishment, past wide-eyed cashiers and patrons who had abruptly discovered profound interest in their grocery manifests. Outside, the waning afternoon had transmuted to gold, the kind of resplendent day that ordinarily entices individuals onto their verandas, yet the pavements were conspicuously devoid of people. As the officers propelled Eleanor toward their patrol vehicle, Eleanor discerned that both officers' body cameras had been deactivated. "Your cameras are inoperative," she remarked. "Technical difficulties," Harris quipped, exchanging a knowing glance with his partner. The vehicular passage to District 18 was measured and deliberately sluggish, intended to disorient. They alternated routes, ensuring Eleanor remained unaware of their trajectory, transforming what should have been a quarter-hour journey into an odyssey lasting nearly an hour. She reclined mutely in the rear, memorizing each turn, each street nomenclature, each minute aspect that might subsequently prove pertinent. Within the precinct, fluorescent luminaires hummed overhead, projecting stark shadows across worn linoleum floors. The booking sector exuded an odor of stale coffee and despair. Officer Mitchell completed his written account with melodramatic flourishes, occasionally chuckling to himself as he embellished the narrative. "Let us see," he murmured, sufficiently loud for Eleanor to overhear. Subject manifested combativeness upon approach, attempted to strike officer, resisted apprehension. Eleanor maintained an immaculate posture in the rigid plastic chair, her wrists still restrained behind her back. "Those are falsifications, and you are cognizant thereof." A desk sergeant ambled over, a coffee container in hand. "What are we apprehended here?" Disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, assault upon an officer, Mitchell enumerated each allegation, becoming more preposterous than its predecessor. "Had to subdue her when she endeavored to assault me with a produce display." The sergeant barely glanced at Eleanor before nodding. "Book her. Chief Callahan desires immaculate documentation regarding this case." Eleanor's auditory perceptions sharpened at the mention of the police superintendent, registering another appellation for future reference. She scrutinized the sergeant as he departed, already dismissing her existence from his consciousness. They acquired her fingerprints, forcibly pressing each digit against the scanner with superfluous vehemence. Her photograph captured her dignity, even in restraints, head erect, gaze directed forward, refusing to be diminished. "I desire my telephone privilege," Eleanor stated resolutely as they guided her toward the holding cells. Mitchell's laughter resonated off the concrete walls. "Perhaps tomorrow, should we not be excessively occupied. The night shift is understaffed, as you are undoubtedly aware." The cell into which they thrust her was frigid and sparsely furnished, containing merely a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet readily visible to any passerby. The door clanged shut with finality that would have unsettled a less steadfast soul. Eleanor seated herself upon the bench, her spine erect, her intellect sharp. She hearkened to the officers' departing footsteps, to their levity as they deliberated their plans for the evening. She overheard Mitchell contacting an individual, presumably Chief Callahan, to communicate that the situation had been managed neatly. Throughout the nocturnal hours, she scrutinized. Officers traversed the corridor, some averting their gaze, others staring with blatant animosity. She noted the manner in which certain dossiers were conveyed into a rear chamber, how hushed colloquies transpired in corners, how the overnight contingent proceeded with the effortless familiarity of individuals who understood their deeds would never be subjected to scrutiny. In the initial hours of the morning, when the district had reached its zenith of quiescence, Eleanor overheard two officers conversing regarding another apprehension. "Precisely as we did with the elderly woman," one stated. "Camera off. Clean report. Magistrate authorizes. Case closed." Eleanor lowered her eyelids, not in capitulation but in computation. They possessed no comprehension of whom they were confronting, no conception of the cataclysm they had instigated. She reflected upon her son, Malcolm, of the influence and assets at his command as a United States Attorney General. These officers believed they were adhering to their standard playbook, yet they had committed the most grievous blunder of their vocations. As dawn commenced to filter through the elevated fenestrations of the precinct, Eleanor Davis remained seated in her cell, already drafting in her cerebrum the test that would precipitate the collapse of this unscrupulous structure. They had furnished her with front-row accommodations to their enterprise, never anticipating that each detail, each appellation, each procedure was being meticulously cataloged by an intellect honed by decades of instructing and a lifetime of navigating a system designed to subjugate. The morning contingent arrived, conveying the aroma of recently brewed coffee and the murmur of casual conversation. Eleanor overheard Mitchell clocking out, his vocalization resonating down the corridor as he jested with the incoming officers regarding the troublemaker in Cell 3. Little did he realize that the genuine disruption was merely commencing. Throughout the ordeal, Eleanor sustained her dignity, her resolve, and, most crucially, her awareness. Each chuckle, each annotation, each procedural transgression was another nail in their coffin. They surmised they were imparting a lesson upon her regarding remaining in her designated sphere. Conversely, they were furnishing her with the comprehensive compendium of proof indispensable for imparting a definitive lesson regarding equity, authority, and the ramifications of disparaging a 78-year-old former pedagogue who had devoted her existence to contesting analogous conflicts. The groundwork was presently established for a confrontation poised to destabilize the department at its foundation, despite the prevailing obliviousness among its members. As the morning sun's rays ultimately permeated the precinct's windows, Eleanor Davis permitted herself a subtle smile. They bestowed upon her precisely what she required, a front-row vantage point to their corruption, alongside the impetus to dismantle it in its entirety. The break of dawn had illuminated District 18, yet Eleanor Davis remained vigilant within her detention chamber, accumulating every fragmentary piece of data attainable. The morning rotation ushered in unfamiliar visages, novel exchanges, and supplementary substantiation of the malfeasance seemingly permeating every recess of the edifice. Officer Mitchell's vocalizations echoed through the corridor as he concluded his shift report, asserting, "Ensure the elderly woman remains confined until we finalized all the paperwork, precluding any potential difficulties." Eleanor observed through the cell's apertures as a collective of officers converged near the coffee dispensing apparatus, their utterances resonating amidst the tranquil early hours. Detective James Wilson, a corpulent individual with thinning gray hair, gesticulated expressively while conversing with two subordinate officers. "You'd scarcely believe the ease with which it's accomplished," Wilson chuckled, stirring his coffee in a leisurely manner. Plan a diminutive article within their conveyance, and suddenly that habitual traffic interception metamorphoses into a substantial apprehension. The department garners another triumph. We secure our emoluments. All parties are content, he paused, taking a sip. Or rather, all parties of significance at any rate. A rookie officer, youthful in aspect and exhibiting uncertainty, shifted uncomfortably. But what regarding the body-worn video recorders? Technical contingencies transpire perennially, Cadet. Wilson winked. Hardware breakdown, power supply depletion. Footage suffers degradation. Simply solicit elucidation from Mitchell concerning last night's arrest. Eleanor committed to memory their countenances, their designations as displayed on their insignia, every minute particularity that might subsequently prove advantageous. Her appendages might be shackled, yet her intellect remained as acute as ever, meticulously documenting substantiation of their perfidy. Down the corridor, she discerned the shift sergeant, Patrick Walsh, scrutinizing reports. Mitchell's redaction regarding the Davis apprehension necessitates refinement. It must be rendered more sanitary, more plausible. Append a testimonial from that store's director. What's his nomenclature? Parker? Yes. Procure his signature upon any document we present. Already accomplished. Another voice rejoined. Parker has a historical record of petty larceny allegations at his establishment. We wouldn't desire those to be subjected to unanticipated investigation, would we? Eleanor's containment area was situated proximally to the evidentiary repository, affording her an optimal perspective to observe the ingress and egress of officers. She observed as Detective Wilson entered bearing a cardboard receptacle labeled Evidence, Case NRA 4789. Through the marginally ajar doorway, she perceived him extracting items, substituting them with others, gingerly modulating the contents before resealing. A female officer, Detective Lisa Carter, according to her insignia, traversed adjacent to Eleanor's detention area, her gait decelerating as she glanced internally. In contradistinction to the others, her facial expression conveyed a nuance of apprehension, conceivably even guilt. She persisted onward to the evidentiary repository, where Wilson remained engaged in his activities. You cannot perpetuate this undertaking, James. Lisa's vocalizations resonated distinctly within Eleanor's cell. Eventually, someone will perceive it. Wilson's laughter possessed a dismissive quality. Have operated in this capacity for a decade and a half, Lisa. No individual notices, owing to the absence of inclination to notice. Chief Callahan certainly evinces no concern, contingent upon the preservation of favorable statistics. Lisa's rejoinder was curtailed by the advent of Officer Harris, who burst into the evidentiary repository with agitated vigor. The chief desires expungement of all body-worn video recordings from last night. Claims as a directive from above. Above? Lisa queried. You allude to the mayor? Harris lowered his voice, though Eleanor remained capable of discerning his utterances distinctly. Magistrate Whitaker communicated personally, asserting that this necessitates utter elision. Eleanor's superciliary regions ascended infinitesimally at this supplementary revelation. A magistrate implicated in the concealment added an additional stratum to the corruption she was uncovering. She extinguished her visual faculties, feigning slumber, yet hearkening intently as Harris perpetuated. The magistrate asserts that we must ensure the tenability of this case, precluding any extraneous elements from remaining outstanding. Wilson's response was instantaneous. What regarding that you possessing the mobile device, whom Mitchell apprehended whilst recording? Harris assured him. We possess his particulars. Any erroneous maneuver will result in his facing significant charges. Throughout the duration of the morning, Eleanor observed a continuous influx of officers entering and departing the evidentiary repository, each bearing dossiers or evidentiary receptacles, each participating in what was unequivocally a well-established methodology of corruption. She observed as they casually modified reports, expunged video recordings, and fabricated substantiation, all the while jesting concerning their weekend schemata, as though this constituted merely another routine day at the office. Around the midday interval, the ambience within the precinct underwent a transformation. Police Superintendent Bob Callahan had arrived, his presence signaled by the abrupt straightening of vertebral columns and apprehensive glances among the officers. Eleanor observed through her containment area's apertures as he strode down the corridor, his silver hair immaculately coiffured, his uniform immaculate. Callahan halted at the sergeant's station, his vocal tone conveying a nuance of concern. The mayor's administrative offices communicated, desiring assurance that all elements are under control here. All elements managed, Chief. Walsh assured him. Mitchell's report is sanitized, body-worn video recordings have been expunged, and we possess witness testimonials corroborating our version of events. Satisfactory, Callahan nodded. Magistrate Whitaker is poised to expedite the paperwork. We necessitate the rapid conclusion of this matter, precluding the incipience of inquiries. The chief's telephonic device emitted an auditory signal, and Eleanor observed as he acknowledged it, his facial expression transitioning from self-assurance to apprehension. Affirmative, Mr. Mayor. No. Sir, all facets are managed. The magistrate is personally administrating. Affirmative, sir. I comprehend the import. Upon terminating the connection, Callahan summoned his senior officers for an assembly within his quarters. Eleanor was precluded from direct visual contact, yet their vocalizations resonated through the ventilation conduits into her confinement area. Attend, all. Callahan's vocal tone was taut. Mayor Kensington desires containment of this situation. Should word disseminate regarding the occurrences within this precinct, we are all doomed. The Davis apprehension necessitates impeccable management. No imperfections, no extraneous vestiges. What regarding the establishment surveillance footage? An individual queried. Already resolved. Another vocalization rejoined. Technical malfunction. All footage from yesterday afternoon has been expunged. Eleanor discerned the shuffling of documents. Then Callahan's resumption. I am scheduled to convene with the mayor and magistrate Whitaker at Morton Steakhouse this evening. We necessitate confirmation of universal alignment prior to progression of this matter. The assembly persisted, with officers deliberating diverse cases necessitating sanitization, alongside substantiation requiring obliteration. Eleanor remained unmoving, internalizing every utterance, every designation, every particularity of their corrupt endeavor. As afternoon gave way to evening, Detective Lisa Carter traversed adjacent to Eleanor's confinement area once more, this time decelerating to a complete cessation. She glanced bilaterally down the corridor prior to approaching the bars. Mrs. Davis, she vocalized softly, are you in satisfactory condition? Do you require anything? Eleanor met her visual perception steadily. I necessitate the execution of my telephonic privilege. It has surpassed a duration of 24 hours. Lisa vacillated, internal conflict manifestly discernible upon her visage. Following another perusal of the corridor, she extracted a cellular telephone. Executed expeditiously. Should any individual inquire, this eventuality never transpired. Eleanor's phalanges exhibited no oscillation as she initiated the dialing sequence to her son's designation. Malcolm acknowledged on the second auditory emission. Mom, where are you? I've been endeavoring to establish contact. Eleanor's vocal tone was subdued, yet distinct. They are concealing something colossal here, something that extends to the apogee. What? Who's concealing what, Mom? Where are you? District 18, Eleanor rejoined, scrutinizing Lisa's apprehensive glances down the corridor. Son, I necessitate your attentive listening. These individuals presume themselves inviolable. They presume the absence of observers, yet they have exhibited slovenliness and overconfidence. I have witnessed sufficiently within the preceding 24 hours to precipitate the disintegration of this entire department. Malcolm's sharp inhalation of breath was audible. District 18, remain stationary. Mom, refrain from affixing your signature to any document. Refrain from providing any declarations. I am en route. Eleanor's vocal tone was resolute. Desist from personally arriving. Dispatch your investigative unit. This extends beyond merely my apprehension. They possess magistrates in their patronage, the mayor implicated. They are in the process of eradicating substantiation as we communicate. Lisa tapped Eleanor's shoulder with urgency. The auditory perception of approaching footfalls was evident. Eleanor promptly concluded her telephonic communication. Malcolm, they are concealing something colossal here. She delivered the mobile telephone back to Lisa precisely as Officer Mitchell materialized, his facial features contorting into a sneer upon observing Lisa proximally to confinement area. Fraternizing with the prisoner Carter? Lisa straightened, maintaining a composed demeanor. She articulated that she was simply performing a welfare verification, adhering to standard operational protocols. Mitchell's sardonic laughter echoed, questioning the sudden prioritization of protocol within that specific precinct. Following Lisa's departure, Mitchell leaned against the cell's bars, his tone descending to a menacing murmur. "Trust you're finding your sojourn agreeable, Mrs. Davis. Judge Whitaker is postured to ascertain its protracted nature." Eleanor maintained visual contact, calmly asserting that each hour spent within that confinement translated to an additional hour observing him and his colleagues contravening the law. Mitchell's countenance reddened, cautioning her to moderate her discourse, intimating that accidents are prone to transpire during detainment. However, Eleanor discerned the initial glimmer of apprehension within his gaze. She had maintained a quiescent, observant presence throughout excessive unguarded colloquies. They had exhibited imprudence and overconfidence, neglecting to contemplate that the elderly African-American female, ensnared within a holding cell, might possess significance beyond her outward presentation. As nocturnal shadows enveloped District 18, the building's energy underwent another transformation. Officers traversed the corridors with accelerated strides, their deportment exhibiting increased urgency, their conversations hushed. Eleanor gleaned fragments of apprehensive deliberations regarding an impending convocation between the chief, the mayor, and the judge. Throughout this upheaval, she remained quiescent within her cell, a seemingly innocuous senior citizen who had borne witness to the entirety of their actions. They had furnished her with front-row accommodations to their corruption, neglecting to envision that every minute particular was being meticulously archived by an intellect honed through decades of pedagogy and a lifetime of challenging inequities. Within the obscurity of her cell, Eleanor permitted herself a diminutive smile. They erroneously believed they were imparting a lesson concerning remaining confined to her designated sphere. Contrarily, they had endowed her with precisely what she necessitated: substantiation of their transgressions, attestation of their malfeasance, and, most significantly, admittance to the very system they employed for self-preservation. A maelstrom was impending, yet none apprehended its approach. However, Eleanor Davis comprehended that, by that juncture the subsequent day, her son would possess all indispensable assets to dismantle their corrupt empire. They had committed a pivotal error, disparaging a 78-year-old former instructor who had devoted her existence to challenging analogous conflicts. Presently, as a consequence of their inherent arrogance, she possessed the substantiation requisite to precipitate their collective downfall. Malcolm Davis occupied his Washington, D.C. office, his mother's pronouncements reverberating within his consciousness. They're concealing something monumental here. His phalanges tapped repetitively against the polished mahogany surface as he processed the implications of her communication. The U.S. Attorney General rarely became directly enmeshed in localized law enforcement affairs. However, this situation diverged. This was intrinsically personal. "Sarah," he summoned his chief of staff, "procure all information attainable concerning District 18, and I stipulate all." Sarah Williams, an astute woman in her 40s who had collaborated with Malcolm for over a decade, was already taking action. "I'm convening a task force immediately. Shall I contact the local Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI division?" "Not imminently." Malcolm's tone was calculated, controlled. "Let us discern the parameters of what we are confronting initially. Moreover, Sarah, no individual external to this office shall gain awareness of this, not until we are poised." Within an hour, Malcolm's capacious office had undergone transformation into a command epicenter. Analysts pored over precinct records, financial statements, and complaint histories. The pattern that manifested was disconcerting, yet unsurprising. A consistent escalation in civil asset forfeitures, a suspicious volume of dismissed grievances, and an unusually elevated incidence of technical malfunctions concerning body-worn video apparatuses. "Sir," one of his analysts announced, "this necessitates your perusal." She retrieved a digital spreadsheet on her portable computing device. District 18's apprehension rates for minority populations are triple that of any other district within the municipality, yet their conviction rates approach perfection. That is statistically untenable, barring. "Unless they are fabricating substantiation," Malcolm concluded, his jaw tightening. "Persevere in digging." The telephonic device positioned upon his desktop emitted an audible signal via a secure line. solely utilized for sensitive matters. "Davis," he acknowledged. "Mr. Attorney General." Mayor Kensington's tonality exuded artificial solicitude. "I have merely now become cognizant of an unfortunate occurrence involving your maternal relative. I desire to reassure you that this transpires as a misapprehension. We stand prepared to effect her immediate release, accompanied by our most sincere apologies." Malcolm's laughter possessed a chilling quality. "Mayor Kensington, I fear that such an intervention is belated. However, I extend my gratitude for validating your implication within this matter." The mayor's sharp inhalation of breath was audible. "Now, let us eschew impetuosity. I am confident we can cultivate an arrangement that proves mutually beneficial." "The sole element that would prove mutually advantageous is a comprehensive inquest into your precinct's methodologies," Malcolm retorted, "and that inquest commences presently." He terminated the telephonic connection prior to the mayor's capacity to respond, pivoting to Sarah. "Procure Judge Thompson within the federal circuit. We shall necessitate certain warrants." Across the municipality, Detective Lisa Carter sat within her station vehicle external to District 18, her extremities trembling faintly as she fixated upon the USB drive positioned upon the passenger seat. Years of accumulated substantiation, erased body-worn video, recordings she had succeeded in recuperating duplicate replicas of falsified reports, recordings of colloquies pertaining to monetary inducements and concealed operations. She had been amassing everything, awaiting the opportune instant, the appropriate individual to entrust with its custody. Her telephonic device emitted an auditory signal. A text communiqué from Officer Mitchell conveyed the following: "Chief mandates universal presence early tomorrow. Significant convocation concerning the Davis situation." Lisa retrieved the USB drive, formulating her determination. She navigated to a coffee retail establishment situated 3 townships removed, utilized their publicly accessible wireless interconnection, and transmitted an encrypted electronic communication to the Attorney General's administrative offices. Subsequently, she drove homeward, navigating a circuitous route to obviate any potential surveillance. Anew in Washington, Malcolm's task force was constructing their case. Sarah entered his office bearing a collection of printed documents. "We have obtained something momentous. A detective originating from District 18 has dispatched the Treasury of Substantiation. She's been accumulating it for years." Malcolm devoted the subsequent hour to scrutinizing the files. Video recordings depicted officers planning substantiation. Audio recordings captured deliberations concerning monetary inducements, and spreadsheets delineated protection racket they operated upon localized enterprises. However, the association with Judge Whitaker precipitated Malcolm's erect posture. "Attend to this," he directed, indicating a sequence of banking transfers. Each instance of Whitaker dismissing a case involving District 18 officers, a substantial pecuniary deposit manifest within an offshore financial institution affiliated with his wife's maiden designation. Sarah nodded. "And there is more. The mayor has been receiving kickbacks originating from civil asset forfeitures. They are employing a fictitious entity to launder pecuniary gains through localized developmental endeavors." Malcolm rose, walking to the fenestration that overlooked the herbs. They became imprudent, exceedingly at ease and excessively self-assured. He pivoted back toward his task force. Less induced discomfort. He retrieved his telephonic device, dialing a designation he seldom employed. "This transpires as Attorney General Davis. I necessitate a task force comprised of federal marshals poised and mobilized within the ensuing hour, and procure Director Phillips at the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The apparatus of federal law enforcement commenced its operation. Task forces were convened, warrants were prepared, and surveillance units assumed strategic placements surrounding District 18. Malcolm observed the constituent elements aligning, cognizant that timing would prove pivotal. At District 18, Chief Callahan was in a state of panic. He had recently received intelligence that Eleanor Davis was the Attorney General's maternal relative, and presently, his meticulously constructed reality was threatening to unravel. He paced within his quarters, his telephonic device pressed against his auditory receptacle. "We necessitate elimination of her." Judge Whitaker's tonality crackled through the communication conduit. "Relocate her to maximum security. Misplace her within the system for a few days. Grant us the temporal latitude to sanitize this affair." Callahan wiped perspiration from his forehead. "And what transpires upon the advent of the federal authorities' inquest? They shall unearth nothing," Whitaker assured him. "We have executed this maneuver previously." However, they had not executed this maneuver formally with an individual resembling Eleanor Davis, nor with the Attorney General's administrative offices in direct observation. Callahan discerned this verity, albeit he would not confess it to Whitaker. He terminated the telephonic connection and summoned officers Mitchell and Harass. "We are transferring the Davis woman tonight to maximum security at the state penitentiary." Mitchell's visual perceptions dilated. "Sir, that does not represent standard protocol for—" "Since when has protocol been a concern to you?" Callahan snapped. "Effectuate the transfer." What none comprehended was that Detective Lisa Carter was hearkening external to Callahan's quarters, archiving everything upon her telephonic device. As soon as the convocation concluded, she dispatched another encrypted electronic communique to Malcolm's administrative offices. Malcolm received the admonition precisely as he was preparing to depart for the day. "Sir," Sarah burst into his quarters, "they are contriving to transfer your maternal relative tonight to maximum security." "Indeed they shall not." Malcolm's tonality possessed a steely quality. He retrieved his telephonic device. "Execute the warrants forthwith." Across the urbs, federal agents maneuvered into strategic placements. Task forces encompassed District 18, while others progressed toward the residences of Judge Whitaker, Mayor Kensington, and Chief Callahan. The judicial snare was tightening. Within her containment area, Eleanor discerned the amplified activity, the accelerated footfalls, the apprehensive colloquies. Officer Mitchell materialized bearing relocation documentation. "Time for a diminutive excursion," he sneered. However, Eleanor discerned the trepidation concealed behind his bravado. Prior to Mitchell's capacity to unlock the confinement area, the precinct's front portals burst asunder. Federal marshals flooded the premises, weapons drawn, insignia displayed. Federal agents, all individuals, maintained their designated positions. The ensuing bedlam possessed an intrinsic beauty within its precision. Officers were segregated, telephonic devices and computing apparatuses were confiscated, and dossiers were secured prior to any individual's capacity to eradicate them. Mitchell discovered himself face down on the floor, being secured by a marshal displaying none of the compassion previously denied Eleanor. Chief Callahan attempted to flee to his rear office, presumably intending to reach the paper shredder that had salvaged him on countless prior occasions. He progressed a mere 3 paces before being tackled by federal agents. Throughout this unfolding drama, Eleanor remained composed within her cell, observing justice finally overtaking those who had deemed themselves exempt from its jurisdiction. Upon the cell door's aperture, it was neither Mitchell nor Harass holding the key, but rather a federal marshal exhibiting respect in his demeanor. "Mrs. Davis, we are present to escort you from these premises." Eleanor rose, adjusting her attire with dignity. As she traversed the precinct, she witnessed the ramifications of her patience and observation. Officers in restraints, evidence undergoing boxing and labeling, and computers being seized. Her gaze intersected Detective Lisa Carter's across the room, and she offered the younger woman a subtle nod of acknowledgement. External to the edifice, television news crews had congregated, their cameras capturing the moment as federal agents escorted out the corrupt officers who had deemed themselves inviolable. Eleanor emerged into the evening atmosphere, her head erect, her spirit undiminished. Malcolm was awaiting her presence beside a black sport utility vehicle SUV, his typically composed demeanor experiencing a slight fracture at the sight of his maternal figure. "Mom," he exclaimed, advancing to embrace her. "Are you unharmed?" "I am well, son," Eleanor responded, patting his cheek, "but we possess work to execute. I have observed sufficiently within that locale to occupy your office for months." Malcolm assisted her into the SUV, then directed his attention to his task force. "I desire every piece of evidence cataloged and secured, every computer analyzed, and every file scrutinized. No individual shall repose until we comprehend the full scope of this operation." As they departed from District 18, Eleanor observed through the window as supplementary federal vehicles arrived. She witnessed Mayor Kensington being escorted from City Hall in restraints, his customary swagger supplanted by shocked incredulity. News helicopters circulated overhead, their spotlights illuminating the unfolding drama. They never envisioned it materializing, Eleanor remarked, her tone conveying a nuance of satisfaction. All that authority, all that malfeasance, and they were undone by underestimating a senior citizen. Malcolm smiled, recognizing the pedagogical inflection within his mother's vocalization. They granted you 24 hours to observe their operation. That represented their most significant error, one among many. Eleanor concurred, stating, "However, there exists more, Malcolm. What I observed within that locale, what I overheard, transcends this precinct. They possess affiliations throughout the system, judges, politicians, business magnates. We shall locate them all." Malcolm pledged, "Every last individual." The SUV veered onto the highway, proceeding toward the federal building, wherein task forces of investigators were already congregating. Eleanor Davis maintained an upright posture within her seat, her intellect already organizing the evidence she would present. She had dedicated decades to instructing young minds to engage in critical thought, to challenge authority, and to advocate for what is righteous. Presently, she would impart one definitive lesson, this time to those who have forgotten that justice, while occasionally protracted, remains inevitable. Within offices across the municipality, telephones were emitting audible signals as corrupt officials recognized their temporal constraints. Judge Whitaker canceled his dinner reservations and contacted his legal counsel. Mayor Kensington's assistant was shredding documents when federal agents burst into her administrative office. Chief Callahan was confined within a holding cell, akin to the one in which he had placed Eleanor, contemplating how the entire edifice had crumbled so expeditiously. However, all were cognizant, even if they resisted avowal, that they had committed the pivotal error of presuming that authority equated to impunity, that their badges and designations rendered them inviolable. They had disregarded the verity that justice could originate from unforeseen sources, in this particular instance, from a 78-year-old former instructor who had dedicated her existence to preparing others to advocate for what is righteous. As nocturnal shadows enveloped the herbs, Eleanor Davis observed from the federal building as the empire of malfeasance commenced its disintegration. Task forces of investigators labored through the evidence she and Detective Carter had furnished, constructing a case that would destabilize the municipality's power structure to its very core. "You are aware that they will endeavor to retaliate," Malcolm stated, standing adjacent to her at the fenestration. Eleanor smiled, the identical smile that had encouraged generations of students to harbor faith in themselves. "Let them attempt. We possess something they lack. And that is the truth," Eleanor responded simply. "And after all these years, I have ascertained that the truth, when properly presented, constitutes the most potent instrument of all." Malcolm nodded, comprehending that his maternal relative had merely imparted an additional lesson. As federal agents persisted in processing evidence and constructing their case, Eleanor Davis maintained vigil, cognizant that her 24 hours within a detention chamber had set into motion transformations that would reshape the municipality's future. The maelstrom she had pledged had materialized, and it was merely commencing to amass strength. The morning subsequent to federal raid upon District 18 dawned frigid and ashen. Within his private chamber, Judge William Whitaker paced frenetically, his telephonic device pressed against his auditory receptacle. The localized news media was disseminating incessant coverage of the preceding nocturnal occurrences, and his designation had already been referenced in conjunction with the inquest. "We necessitate containment of the situation," he barked into the communication conduit. "Locate something incriminating regarding the youth who archived the apprehension." What was his designation? Jordan Carter? Chief Callahan's vocalization was strained, even to the telephonic device. Though released on bail, the police chief was palpably experiencing duress. "However, sir, with the federal authorities involved, I harbor no concern for the federal authorities," Whitaker interjected. "Frame the youth if necessitated. We necessitate discreditation of any potential witnesses prior to their capacity to provide testimony." Across the township, Officers Mitchell and Harris were already effectuating the schemata. They occupied their unmarked conveyance external to Jordan Carter's apartment domicile, observing as the youth departed for his early morning rotation at the localized computing apparatus repair establishment. "Recollect," Mitchell murmured, verifying his weapon. "Effectuate an authentic presentation." They tarried until Jordan was situated midway toward his vehicle prior to initiating their maneuver. Mitchell exited the conveyance, insignia displayed. "Mr. Carter, we necessitate colloquy with you regarding a robbery that transpired last evening." Jordan ceased movement, his keys clutched tightly within his hand. He recalled, with excessive clarity, their antecedent encounter at Thompson's Market. "I was present within my domicile throughout the duration of the night. I possess witnesses." Harris circled behind him, and Jordan perceived his cardiac rhythm accelerating. He comprehended what was impending, having observed the scenario unfold on numerous prior occasions. Witnesses are susceptible to erroneous recollection. Mitchell's smile was frigid as he reached for an item within his jacket. Occasionally, they recall elements diversely subsequent to their having enjoyed sufficient temporal latitude for contemplation. The diminutive sachet of controlled substances materialized within Mitchell's appendage, as if by magic, and Jordan's circulatory fluid transformed frigid. He possessed precise cognizance of what was imminent, cognizant that his existence was poised to undergo transformation permanently, and there existed no action he could undertake to avert it. However, fate, it materialized, possessed alternative schemata. From across the street, a diminutive crimson illumination blinked within the early morning obscurity. Detective Lisa Carter occupied her own unmarked conveyance, her photographic apparatus archiving the entirety of the proceedings. She had anticipated this maneuver, cognizant that they would endeavor to silence potential witnesses. As she observed Mitchell implanting substantiation, she dispatched a precomposed electronic communication to Malcolm Davis's administrative offices, complete with her present geographical coordinates and live video feed. The ensuing minutes unfolded akin to a meticulously choreographed ballet. Precisely as Mitchell prepared to unearth the planet-controlled substances, 3 unmarked federal vehicles converged upon the locale. Mitchell and Harris discovered themselves supine upon the damp pavement, their own restraints being employed against them. Jordan remained immobilized, observing as federal agents retrieved the planet's substantiation and documented the scenario. A gentle appendage contacted his appendage, and he pivoted to discover Lisa Carter beside him. "You are secure presently," she stated quietly. "However, we necessitate relocation to a secure locale. They shall endeavor again." Within his chambers, Judge Whitaker was exerting effort on an alternative tactic. He drafted an emergency gag mandate, citing national security apprehensions and potential prejudice to ongoing inquests. His clerk, Amanda Pierce, observed with escalating disquietude as he backdated the document. "Sir," she ventured cautiously, "this mandate will lack tenability under federal scrutiny." Whitaker's laughter was caustic. "It necessitates non-tenability perpetually, merely sufficiently prolonged to grant us temporal latitude to sanitize the chamber." He affixed his endorsement to the mandate with greater vehemence than indispensable. "Transmit this mandate to every news dissemination outlet within the urbs. Any individual who contravenes it shall confront contempt charges." However, he had underestimated the celerity with which Malcolm Davis operated. By the juncture at which the gag mandate reached the news desks, Malcolm had already disseminated selected portions of the evidence to key journalists. The narrative was proliferating akin to a wildfire across social media platforms, far beyond Whitaker's jurisdiction. At the federal building, Eleanor Davis sat with a task force of investigators, methodically scrutinizing her declaration. Every particularity she had observed throughout her detainment was undergoing cross-referencing with Detective Carter's evidence and the precinct's own records. "Mrs. Davis," Special Agent Rachel Thompson leaned forward. "You referenced overhearing colloquies regarding protection racket. Could you elaborate?" Eleanor's recollection was impeccable, her pedagogical memory serving her proficiently. Officer Wilson exhibited considerable pride. Jurisdiction required monthly security payments, and those who declined faced persistent intimidation. Violations of health codes, parking fines, and enigmatic break-ins plagued the community. As she conveyed her thoughts, another investigative team was tracing the financial pathway. The security payments had been laundered through a network of shell corporations, all ultimately linked to accounts overseen by Mayor James Kensington and his associates. The mayor himself was engaged in damage control efforts. He convened a press conference on the steps of City Hall, his usual confident demeanor firmly in place despite the mounting pressure. "These allegations are entirely baseless," he proclaimed to the gathered reporters. Mrs. Davis's arrest was regrettable, but it was executed in accordance with standard protocols. Any insinuation of systemic corruption is merely a misunderstanding. Among the crowd, journalists who had received Malcolm's evidence dossier exchanged knowing glances. They had witnessed the proof: the falsified reports, the financial documents, and the retrieved body camera footage. The mayor's statements fell hollow against the growing weight of evidence accumulating against him. However, the genuine drama was unfolding at Precinct 18. Detective Lisa Carter returned to her office to clear out her desk, fully aware that her position there had become untenable. As she gathered her belongings, she could sense the hostile glares from her former colleagues. Officer Sarah Turner, once a friend, approached her desk. "You have betrayed us, Lisa. Everything we built here, everything we strive for, you discarded it all." Lisa continued her task of packing, her movements deliberate. "What we built was fundamentally flawed, Sarah. What we worked towards was corruption, pure and simple. We maintained order." Sarah's voice was harsh. "We made the city safe." "Safe for whom?" Lisa finally looked up. "Safe for the affluent, for the well-connected. What about individuals like Jordan Carter or Ellen Davis? When were they ever secure in our city?" Before Sarah could respond, a disturbance erupted in the hallway. Federal agents had returned, this time armed with more specific warrants. They headed directly for the records room, where decades of case files were archived. Lisa observed as her former colleagues scrambled to appear cooperative while subtly attempting to destroy evidence, but it was too late. Malcolm's team had already accessed the precinct's backup servers, recovering every deleted file and every altered report. In his private office, Chief Callahan received an urgent call from Mayor Kensington. "This needs to go away." The mayor's voice trembled with barely contained fury. Callahan understood perfectly. He had been the mayor's fixer for years, managing delicate situations and making problems vanish. But this time was different. This time, they faced an adversary who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be silenced. In a last-ditch effort, he ordered his most trusted officers to target Lisa Carter. "She's the weak link," he instructed them. "Remove her from the equation, and this all unravels." But Lisa was already one step ahead. As two officers approached her vehicle that evening, they found themselves surrounded by federal agents. Malcolm had anticipated this move as well, ensuring that the key witness in his case remained safeguarded. The following morning, the city awoke to breaking news. Judge Whitaker's gag order had been lifted by a federal judge, and the full story was finally reaching the public. News helicopters circled over Precinct 18, capturing footage of federal agents transporting box after box of evidence. Eleanor Davis watched the coverage from Malcolm's office, her expression serene. They never understood, she pondered, that their true mistake wasn't my arrest. It was believing that their power rendered them untouchable. Malcolm nodded, reviewing the latest reports from his investigative team. They've operated like this for so long that they forgot the law applies to them as well. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Williams entered, her face grave. "Sir, we have a situation. Detective Carter's cover has been compromised. Someone leaked her home address to some of Callahan's associates." Malcolm's response was immediate. "Get her out now." Full protective custody. Yet again, Lisa Carter demonstrated her foresight. When Callahan's men arrived at her residence, they discovered it was empty. She had already relocated to a safe house, taking with her even more evidence. Old case files, recorded conversations, and a comprehensive ledger detailing every bribe, every cover-up, and every abuse of power she had witnessed over the years. This ledger proved to be the crucial key that unlocked everything, hidden in an old evidence locker. It contained years of meticulous records, including dates, amounts, and names of officers involved in various schemes. Lisa had been methodically building her case, waiting patiently for the right moment to expose it all. As federal agents meticulously examined the ledger, patterns began to emerge. The corruption extended far beyond Precinct 18. It infiltrated other precincts, other departments, and other cities. The protection racket was merely the tip of the iceberg. Realizing the magnitude of the evidence against him, Mayor Kensington made one last desperate attempt. He called an emergency press conference, intending to portray himself as a reformer who had been striving to expose the corruption all along. However, as he approached the podium, he found Malcolm Davis waiting for him. "Mr. Mayor," Malcolm's voice resonated across the astonished crowd. "I believe these belong to you." He held up a stack of financial records. "Would you care to explain why millions in seized assets were redirected to offshore accounts in your name?" The mayor's face drained of color, and he turned to flee, only to find his escape blocked by federal agents. His arrest, broadcast live on every local channel, marked a pivotal turning point in the investigation. Back at the federal building, Jordan Carter provided his statement, detailing not only Ellen's arrest, but also years of systematic harassment and corruption he had witnessed in his neighborhood. His testimony, combined with Lisa's evidence and Eleanor's observations, painted a damning picture of a system decayed from within. Judge Whitaker attempted one final maneuver to salvage the situation. He called an emergency hearing, hoping to use his authority to suppress the mounting evidence. However, as he entered his courtroom, he found it packed with federal prosecutors, journalists, and Eleanor Davis herself, sitting calmly in the front row. The judge's hands trembled as he took his seat. Before he could utter a word, a federal marshal approached the bench with a warrant for his arrest. The evidence in Lisa's ledger included detailed records of every case he had manipulated, every bribe he had accepted. As Whitaker was led from his own courtroom in handcuffs, Eleanor stood there. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, the judge finally comprehended. They had all underestimated her, viewing her merely as an elderly black woman they thought they could intimidate. They had never imagined she would become the catalyst for their downfall. The day concluded with more arrests, additional evidence seized, and more corrupt officials facing the repercussions of their actions. Lisa Carter, secure in her safe house, continued to provide information to Malcolm's team, aiding them in unraveling decades of corruption. Eleanor Davis returned home that evening, finally able to rest in her own bed. But she knew her work was far from over. She understood that exposing corruption was merely the first step. The real challenge would be ensuring that what had happened to her could never happen to anyone else. As she settled into her favorite chair, she could hear the television in the background reporting on the day's events. The storm she had promised had arrived, and it was reshaping the landscape of power in ways none of them had expected. In his office, Malcolm Davis worked late into the night, constructing the cases that would deliver justice to those who had presumed themselves above the law. On his desk lay his mother's pearl necklace, recovered from the precinct's evidence room, a poignant reminder of why this fight was significant and who had initiated it all. The storm was far from over, but the winds of change were blowing fiercely, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the federal courthouse as Eleanor Davis emerged from her son's SUV. The crowd that had gathered outside erupted at her appearance, journalists shouting questions, photographers jostling for position, supporters holding signs demanding justice. But Eleanor didn't rush or hide. Instead, she paused at the top of the steps, turned to face the cameras, and spoke with a clear, commanding voice that had guided classrooms for over 4 decades. "I am not afraid," she declared, her words slicing through the chaos. Justice will be served. The statement was succinct, but its impact was immediate. Social media erupted with clips of the 78-year-old former teacher confronting corruption with unwavering dignity. Inside the courthouse, Malcolm Davis watched the scene unfold on a monitor, a small smile playing at his lips. He recognized that look in his mother's eyes. It was the same one she had worn when facing down school board officials who attempted to cut funding for disadvantaged students. However, the morning's drama was only beginning. As Eleanor navigated through security, another figure burst through the courthouse doors. Angela Carter, Jordan's mother. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a piece of paper. "Mrs. Davis," she called out, her voice breaking. "Please, I need your help. They're going to kill my boy." Eleanor reached for the woman's hands, steadying them in her own. "Tell me everything." Unfortunate incidents involving witnesses in police corruption cases were becoming increasingly common. "He's just a boy," Angela sobbed. "He was only trying to help you." Malcolm, who had joined them in the courthouse lobby, took the transfer order from Angela's trembling hands. His expression darkened as he read Judge Whitaker's signature, noting that this was his last act before being arrested. "Get him out." Eleanor's voice was steely. Malcolm was already in motion, phone in hand. "Sarah, I need an emergency hearing, and gather everything we have on incident reports from that prison. Focus on the witnesses who never made it to trial." The machinery of federal justice began to churn, but they were racing against time. In his cell, Jordan Carter was already experiencing the special treatment reserved for those who dared to cross the thin blue line. The guards, many of whom had connections to Precinct 18, ensured he understood just how isolated he truly was. Back in the courthouse, Judge Rebecca Anderson's courtroom was filling up for what was initially supposed to be a routine hearing. Instead, she found herself confronted with an urgent motion from the U.S. Attorney General himself. "Your Honor." Malcolm stood before the bench, his presence commanding immediate attention. "We have evidence that Jordan Carter's transfer was ordered specifically to prevent his testimony in an ongoing federal investigation." The prison's attorney, David McThompson, rose to object. "Your Honor, this is merely a standard security procedure. Mr. Carter is charged with violent felony, a felony fabricated by the very officers he was prepared to testify against." Malcolm countered by producing Lisa Carter's latest evidence. Security footage showing officers Mitchell and Harris planting evidence at the scene of Jordan's arrest. Judge Anderson leaned forward, studying the footage meticulously. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "This court orders the immediate transfer of Jordan Carter to federal custody. However, even as the order was being processed, another drama was unfolding in Courtroom 3. Judge Whitaker might have been arrested, but his replacement, Judge Michael Sullivan, seemed determined to uphold the status quo. Eleanor's civil case against the police department was being systematically dismantled. "The court finds insufficient grounds for these allegations," Sullivan declared, his gavel falling with finality. "Case dismissed." Eleanor sat in the front row, her expression unwavering as her attorney promptly filed an appeal. They had anticipated this move. Sullivan's connections to the old guard were well documented in Lisa's ledger. This dismissal was merely another piece of evidence, showcasing the depth of the corruption. Malcolm, arriving from Jordan's hearing, was furious. "They're still trying to play by their old rules," he muttered to his mother. "They haven't realized the game has shifted." "Then let's change it more dramatically," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the journalists in the gallery. The afternoon brought a new wave of revelations. A determined journalist named Rachel Stevens, working with the evidence Malcolm had leaked, published a devastating expose. The article detailed not only individual acts of corruption, but an entire system designed to protect itself while preying on the vulnerable. The story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with shared experiences, other victims of Precinct 18's corruption coming forward, former officers speaking out, and even court clerks revealing patterns of suspicious case dismissals. The wall of silence that had shielded the corrupt system for so long was crumbling. In response, the police union called an emergency press conference. Their spokesperson, Frank Miller, stood before the cameras, attempting to spin the narrative. "These allegations are an attack on every hardworking officer," he declared. "We stand behind our members." Yet his words rang hollow as more evidence emerged. Lisa Carter's ledger had been thorough, documenting not just crimes but the system that enabled them. Each entry was a thread that, when pulled, revealed more corruption, more abuse, and more lives destroyed by those sworn to protect them. The courtroom reconvened late in the afternoon, now packed with press and public alike. The tension was palpable as Eleanor took the stand. She had long awaited this moment, preparing for it during those long hours in her cell. "Mrs. Davis," her attorney began, "please tell the court what you witnessed during your detention." Eleanor's testimony was devastating in its precision. She recounted conversations, described procedures, and named names. Her teacher's memory served her well as she reconstructed the casual corruption she had observed. The gallery sat in stunned silence as she described officers joking about planting evidence, judges fixing cases, and officials accepting bribes. Chief Callahan, seated at the defense table, began to sweat as Eleanor recounted overhearing his phone conversations about destroying evidence. His attorney passed him a note. "We need to discuss a deal," but it was too late for deals. Malcolm's team had been methodically building their case, using Eleanor's testimony as a framework to present the mountain of evidence they had gathered. Financial records confirmed her account of bribes. Recovered body cam footage verified her description of events, and Lisa's ledger provided dates and details that matched Eleanor's recollections perfectly. The prosecution began calling witnesses, business owners who had paid protection money, citizens who had been falsely arrested, and officers who had been coerced into participating in the corruption or risked their careers. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored. During a brief recess, Eleanor sat in a small conference room with Malcolm and his team. The walls were adorned with photos, documents, and diagrams depicting the web of corruption they had uncovered. At the center was a photo of Precinct 18. "They thought the system would protect them," Malcolm observed, studying the evidence. "They never imagined it could be turned against them." Eleanor touched the pearl necklace at her throat, returned to her after being lost in evidence. "They forgot that systems can be changed, son. That's what I taught my students for 40 years. The afternoon session brought a parade of forensic accountants detailing the complex financial schemes that had enriched Callahan, Judge Whitaker, and Mayor Kensington. The jury's eyes widened as the numbers grew. Millions in stolen assets, bribes funneled through shell companies, and evidence room property mysteriously disappearing. But it was a human cost that truly captured their attention. Jordan Carter, now safely in federal custody, testified about years of harassment and profiling. His voice shook as he described the night of Eleanor's arrest, the terror he felt when Mitchell threatened him, and the helplessness of watching justice being perverted. "I knew what they would do to me," he said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. "But I couldn't just watch. Not again. Not after seeing how they treated Mrs. Davis." The defense attorneys attempted to undermine his testimony, trying to paint him as a troublemaker with a grudge against the police. However, Jordan's sincerity, combined with a mountain of evidence supporting his account, made their efforts appear desperate and hollow. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom remained packed. No one wanted to miss a moment of what was becoming a historic dismantling of corruption. Eleanor sat in the front row, her posture perfect, her gaze steady as more witnesses came forward. A former court clerk testified about being ordered to backdate documents. A businessman described how officers had demanded protection money, threatening his family when he refused to pay. A rookie cop, voice trembling, recounted being forced to falsify reports or face retaliation. Each testimony added another crack to the foundation of corruption, another blow to the system that had seemed untouchable just days before. The jurors took endless notes, their expressions growing more troubled with each revelation. Chief Callahan watched his empire crumble, his face growing paler with each damning testimony. His attorneys huddled around him, whispering urgently about plea deals and cooperation agreements. But Malcolm had already made it clear. There would be no deals, no easy outs, no quiet resignations. The day ended with a powerful piece of evidence, the recovered dash cam footage from Eleanor's arrest. The defense had claimed it was lost due to technical difficulties, but Lisa Carter had found it buried deep in encrypted files. The footage displayed everything: the unlawful arrest, the excessive force, the casual cruelty of officers who believed they would never be held accountable. As the video played, Eleanor watched the jury's reactions. She observed the shock in their eyes, the disgust on their faces, and the growing understanding that this wasn't just about one arrest or one precinct. This was about a system that had failed its most fundamental purpose: to serve and protect all citizens equally. The judge called for adjournment as the sun began to set outside. The crowd had grown larger, with protesters demanding justice mingling with reporters waiting for statements. Eleanor emerged into the fading light, her head held high, her resolve unwavering, spirit unbroken. A young reporter pressed forward. Mrs. Davis, How do you feel about today's testimonies?" Eleanor paused, carefully contemplating her words. "Today, we witnessed the dawn of change," she said, her voice resonating across the crowd. "But this is merely the beginning. True justice demands more than just punishing the guilty. It requires us to construct something better in place of what was shattered." As she walked toward the waiting car, supported by her son's steady arm, Eleanor reflected on all the lives impacted by this corrupt system. She thought about Jordan Carter, the business owners coerced into paying bribes, and the innocent individuals languishing in cells based on fabricated evidence. The storm she had promised was here, and it was doing more than just dismantling the old order. It was paving the way for something new, something improved. Eleanor Davis, 78 years old and unyielding, was leading the charge. Malcolm helped her into the car, then paused before closing the door. "You know they'll appeal, trying to drag this out," he warned. Eleanor smiled, the same smile that had inspired countless students to believe in themselves, in justice, and in the potential for change. "Let them try," she replied. "We possess something they never anticipated." "What's that?" he inquired. "The truth," Eleanor said firmly, "and the courage to voice it." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Eleanor watched the crowd in the rear-view mirror. Signs waved, cameras flashed, and voices called for justice. The system that had once seemed so impenetrable was beginning to crack, its foundations shaken by the very people it had attempted to silence. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and Eleanor Davis, former teacher turned catalyst for change, was prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had dedicated her life to preparing others to fight for justice. Now she was demonstrating how it was done. The video hit social media at precisely 3:17 a.m., grainy footage from inside the holding cells at the maximum security facility, where Jordan Carter had been briefly detained. The timestamp indicated it was from 2 days prior, and the images were harrowing. Officers William Peters and Scott Davidson, both known to have connections with Precinct 18, could be clearly seen entering Jordan's cell after the cameras were supposed to be off for the night. What they didn't realize was that Lisa Carter had allies in the facility's IT department. The backup system she had helped install years ago captured everything. The beating, the threats, and the warnings about what could happen to those who testified against the police. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Hashtags trended. Phone lines at the mayor's office crashed from the volume of calls, and news helicopters circled over downtown as crowds began to gather spontaneously outside the courthouse, Precinct 18, and City Hall. Police Chief Callahan, under house arrest but still monitoring police channels, watched as the situation spiraled beyond his control. His phone rang, a secure line he believed couldn't be traced. "This ends now." Mayor Kensington's voice was taut with panic. "Every piece of evidence, every record, every file, destroyed all. I don't care how." But it was already too late. Federal agents had quietly secured every records room, every computer system, and every evidence locker in the precinct. The mayor's directive to destroy evidence only added another charge to the growing list against him. Inside his opulent office, Kensington was becoming increasingly desperate. He called an emergency meeting with his largest donors, the power brokers who had helped sustain the corrupt system for decades. They gathered in a private dining room at the exclusive Summit Club, 50 stories above the chaos unfolding in the streets. "Gentlemen," Kensington addressed a room filled with wealthy businessmen and civic leaders, "we have a situation that demands immediate attention. Our investment in this city's leadership is at risk." Richard Hamilton, a real estate developer who had benefited from years of rigged zoning decisions, spoke first. "How much to make this go away? We can establish a fund, pay off whoever needs paying." "It's beyond that now." Another donor, banking executive William Foster, interjected. "The feds are involved. That changes everything." As they discussed their options, none of them noticed a small red light blinking beneath the crystal centerpiece, another of Lisa Carter's carefully placed recording devices. Every word, every scheme, every admission was being transmitted directly to Malcolm Davis's office. Meanwhile, at the federal building, Malcolm's team was following the money. Financial analyst Jessica Reynolds had spent countless sleepless nights tracing the intricate web of transactions that funded the corruption. "Look at this," She pointed to a series of transfers on her screen. Every time the police conducted a civil asset forfeiture, the seized funds were supposed to go into city accounts. Instead, they were diverted through a series of shell companies, with the final destination being offshore accounts controlled by Kensington and his donors. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars that were meant for community programs, police training, and civic improvements had instead enriched corrupt officials and their allies. The paper trail was complete, but undeniable. Malcolm studied the evidence, his expression grim. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 15 years, Jessica replied. "Maybe longer. They got sloppy recently. They probably thought they were untouchable." The investigation was expanding by the hour. More whistleblowers came forward, encouraged by Lisa Carter's example. A clerk from the permits office revealed how building inspections were rigged to favor certain developers. A former police dispatcher detailed how response times were deliberately delayed in neighborhoods that couldn't afford enhanced protection. Each revelation fueled public outrage. The crowds outside city buildings grew larger and more vocal, with signs demanding justice, reform, and accountability. Local news crews broadcast live as protesters shared their own stories of encounters with corrupt officers. Inside his chambers, Judge Sullivan desperately tried to maintain control. He issued injunction after injunction, attempting to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. But federal judges overturned his orders as quickly as he could write them. His clerk, Mary Williams, watched with growing concern as the judge's behavior became increasingly erratic. When he ordered her to backdate a series of documents, she quietly added another piece of evidence to the growing case against the corrupt system. The mayor made one last attempt to control the narrative. He called a press conference on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by carefully selected supporters. But as he approached the podium, the wind carried the sound of protesters chanting from the street below. "My fellow citizens," he began, his usual confident smile nowhere to be seen. "What we're witnessing is a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by media sensationalism and outside agitators." Rachel Stevens stood up. "Mr. Mayor, can you explain these bank transfers?" She held up documents showing millions moving from seized assets to private accounts. "Or perhaps you'd like to comment on this morning's conversation at the Summit Club?" Kensington's face went pale. How could they know about that meeting? His eyes darted to a security detail, searching for an escape route. But federal agents were already moving to the crowd, warrant in hand. The mayor turned and fled, pushing past staffers and reporters. He made it to the private elevator that led to the building's secure parking garage. But when the doors opened, he found himself face to face with Malcolm Davis. "Going somewhere, Mr. Mayor?" In that moment, Kensington knew it was over. The system he had helped build, the power structure he had maintained through bribes, threats, and corruption, was crumbling around him. As agents led the mayor away in handcuffs, cameras captured every moment. The image of the once powerful man, head bowed, being escorted to a waiting federal vehicle, became the symbol of the day's events. But the most significant revelation was yet to come. Federal agents raided the mayor's mansion and discovered a hidden room behind his private study. Inside were files dating back decades, detailed records of every bribe, every fixed case, and every act of corruption that helped maintain their power. "He kept trophies," Sarah Williams remarked as she reviewed the files. "Records of everyone he owned, everything he controlled." Mal nodded grimly. He probably thought it was insurance. Instead, he gave us everything we needed to dismantle the entire network. The files revealed corruption far beyond what they had initially suspected. Judges, politicians, business leaders. The tentacles of corruption reached into every corner of city government. Each document, each photograph, each recorded conversation added another name to the investigation. At the federal courthouse, Eleanor Davis sat with Jordan Carter and his mother, watching the news coverage of the mayor's arrest. Jordan's bruises were still visible, but his eyes were clear and determined as he reviewed his testimony for the grand jury. "They thought they could silence us," he said quietly, "make us too afraid to speak up." Eleanor patted his hand. "Fear is their weapon, Jordan. Truth is ours." Outside, the crowds had grown larger still, but the anger was transforming into something else, determination. Community leaders spoke about reform, oversight, and building a better system. The people were no longer just protesting. They were demanding change. In his private jet, attempting to flee to a country without extradition, Judge Whitaker received word that his accounts had been frozen. Every escape route he had prepared, every safeguard he had established, had been anticipated and blocked. Federal agents were waiting for him. The tarmac was almost an afterthought as they escorted him away. Whitaker finally grasped what Eleanor Davis had understood from the very beginning. The power they believed made them untouchable had transformed into the instrument of their demise. Back at Precinct 18, officers stood in stunned silence as federal agents diligently continued their systematic collection of evidence. Computers were confiscated, files were boxed up, and decades of corruption were exposed to the harsh light of day. Detective Lisa Carter, now under federal protection, provided the crucial key to unlocking countless cases of abuse and misconduct. Her testimony, combined with years of meticulously collected evidence, painted a vivid picture of systematic failure that could no longer be overlooked. It wasn't merely about the money, she explained to federal investigators. It was fundamentally about power, the ability to control people's lives, to determine who deserved justice and who did not. The investigation expanded beyond the city limits, encompassing other precincts, jurisdictions, and power structures that came under scrutiny. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. What had occurred at Precinct 18 was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. Malcolm Davis worked tirelessly through the night, coordinating with federal prosecutors to build solid cases that would withstand scrutiny. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew from experience that power did not relinquish easily. They will fight back, he cautioned his team. They still have resources, allies, and influence. We need to be meticulous, no loose ends. In the holding cells of the federal building, the magnitude of their downfall began to sink in for the arrested officials. Mayor Kensington, stripped of his designer suits and creature comforts, looked every bit his age. Chief Callahan, no longer in command, sat silently in his cell, refusing to speak even to his lawyers. However, it was Judge Whitaker who ultimately broke. After decades of wielding power from a bench, determining the fates of others while enriching himself, he found himself facing justice from the other side. "I want to make a deal," he told federal prosecutors. "I can provide you with names, dates, details, people you don't even know about yet." Malcolm listened to the judge's desperate offer with cold satisfaction. "No deals," he replied firmly. "You had years to do the right thing. Now you must face the consequences." The day concluded with more arrests, additional evidence seized, and more corrupt officials confronting the justice they had denied others. Lisa Carter, from the safety of her protected location, continued to provide crucial information to Malcolm's team, aiding them in unraveling decades of corruption. Eleanor Davis observed it all unfold with the patience of someone who had dedicated a lifetime to fighting for change. She understood that exposing corruption was merely the first step. The real work, rebuilding trust, establishing accountability, and creating genuine change, was still ahead. As night descended over the city, the crowds remained, their candles and phone lights creating a sea of illumination in the darkness. They were no longer just demanding justice. They were witnessing its arrival. In his office, Malcolm reviewed the day's developments with his team. The mayor's hidden files had opened dozens of new investigations, and the judge's attempted flight had revealed more concealed accounts. "We are not just dismantling a corrupt precinct anymore," he informed his staff. "We are exposing an entire system that has failed its people." Eleanor, sitting quietly in the corner, nodded in agreement. She thought about her students over the years and how she had taught them that change was possible and that justice was worth fighting for. Now she was demonstrating to them how it was done. The city was undergoing a transformation. The outrage that had propelled people into the streets was evolving into a movement for genuine change. Community leaders were organizing, demanding oversight committees, police reform, and transparent governance. As midnight approached, Eleanor stood at her son's office window, gazing out over the city she had called home for 7 decades. The lights of police vehicles and news vans still flickered in the streets below. The crowds had thinned but not dispersed, maintaining their vigil for justice. "You know," she said to Malcolm. "They thought arresting me would silence one voice. Instead, they awakened thousands." Malcolm smiled, seeing in his mother's face the same determination that had guided his own career in justice. "They never understood what you taught me years ago, that real power isn't in controlling people. It's in standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But the tide had turned. The corrupt system that had seemed so impenetrable was crumbling, brought down not by force, but by the courage of those who dared to speak the truth. The storm Eleanor had promised had arrived, and was changing everything in its path. In the basement of Precinct 18, the atmosphere was eerily quiet at 3 a.m. Chief Callahan, out on bail thanks to his expensive legal team's efforts, gathered his most loyal officers in the dimly lit evidence room. Officers Mitchell, Harris, Peters, and Davidson stood in a tight circle, their faces grim under the fluorescent lights. "This ends tonight." Callahan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Carter and Davis are the keys. Remove them, and this whole case falls apart." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with the feds watching—" "I don't care about the feds." Callahan's controlled whisper escalated into a harsh rasp. "Everything we built is crumbling. Either we fix this now or we all go down." In a safe house across town, Lisa Carter sat reviewing her testimony with federal prosecutors. Years of carefully collected evidence spread across the table before her. Photos, recordings, and financial records, each piece another nail in the coffin of corruption. "The bonuses were just the beginning," she explained, pointing to a spreadsheet. "Officers received extra pay for every false arrest that led to asset forfeiture. The more valuable the seized property, the bigger their cut." The lead prosecutor, Andrea Thompson, leaned forward, and Judge Whitaker wasn't the only one. 3 other judges were on the payroll. They dismissed complaints against officers, approved questionable warrants, whatever was needed. Each had their own offshore account managed through the mayor's financial advisor. None of them noticed the red of a laser sight briefly appearing on the window behind Lisa's head. Outside, in a darkened building across the street, Officer Davidson adjusted his scope, but before he could take the shot, the night erupted in light and sound. "Federal agents, drop your weapon." Davidson found himself surrounded. Malcolm's team had anticipated this move and had been waiting for it. As agents led him away in handcuffs, they discovered a burner phone in his pocket, direct evidence linking him to Callahan. The chief's desperation was escalating. His phone rang. It was Judge Whitaker calling from his holding cell. "They're offering me a deal." Whitaker's voice shook. "Full immunity if I testify about everything. The bribes, the fixed cases, the offshore accounts." "Take that deal and you won't live to testify." Callahan's threat was explicit, but Whitaker had already made his choice. Hours of interrogation had shattered his resolve, and the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison had loosened his tongue. He disclosed everything to federal prosecutors: dates, amounts, names of every official they had bribed or blackmailed. At the federal courthouse, Eleanor Davis took the stand for her final day of testimony. The gallery was packed with journalists and citizens alike, eager to hear every word. She described not just her arrest, but the systematic corruption she had witnessed during her detention. "They were so confident in their power," she testified, her voice clear and strong, "that they didn't bother hiding their crimes. They discussed bribes and cover-ups openly, believing no one could touch them." Police union lawyers attempted to discredit her testimony, but Eleanor's recall was impeccable. She cited specific conversations, named officers present in detailed times and locations. Each point was corroborated by Lisa's evidence or the mayor's seized files. During a brief recess, Malcolm received urgent news. His team had raided Callahan's private storage unit, uncovering a treasure trove of blackmail material. The chief had been keeping insurance. Photos, recordings, and documents that implicated dozens of powerful figures in the corruption scheme. "He's been planning for this," Malcolm told his team, ensuring he wouldn't go down alone. But Callahan had one more card to play. As federal agents swarmed his home with a new warrant, he slipped out through a hidden tunnel in his wine cellar, an escape route installed years ago for just such an emergency. The chief's disappearance triggered an immediate response. Roadblocks were established, airports and train stations were monitored, and his face was broadcast on every news channel. However, Malcolm knew Callahan's destination before he even started running. The Canadian border was less than 4 hours away by car. Callahan had a false passport, emergency cash, and a carefully planned route using back roads and rural crossings. What he didn't know was that every step of his escape had been anticipated. As his car approached the border crossing at 3:47 a.m., Callahan felt the first flutter of hope. But when he handed over his fake passport, the border agent's expression didn't change. "Welcome back, Chief Callahan," she said calmly, signaling to concealed federal agents. The former police chief's arrest was unlike any he had ever conducted. There was no excessive force, no planted evidence, no falsified reports, just a cold, impartial application of the law. After spending decades undermining the system, Callahan finally broke down in the holding cell. "I want a deal," he insisted. "I'll take everyone down with me, judges, politicians, business leaders. I have dirt on individuals you haven't even considered yet." Malcolm stood outside the cell, observing the man who had once appeared so formidable. "No deals," he replied firmly, "but we will listen to everything you have to share. Every name, every crime, every detail." Callahan talked for hours, detailing decades of corruption. He explained how the system operated, how they selected their targets, how they launder money, and how they silence witnesses. Each revelation ignited new investigations, leading to fresh arrests and additional charges. The prosecution's case became overwhelmingly strong. Video evidence displayed Callahan ordering the assault on Jordan Carter, while financial records traced millions in stolen assets through his accounts. Recovered body cam footage revealed him instructing officers on how to plant evidence. However, the most incriminating testimony came from his former officers. One by one, they accepted deals, turning against a man who had led their corrupt enterprise. Mitchell recounted how they targeted minorities for false arrests, while Harris detailed a protection racket they operated against local businesses. Each testimony added another layer to the mountain of evidence. In court, the prosecution presented the video of Callahan and Judge Whitaker discussing bribes. The courtroom fell silent as they watched two pillars of the justice system casually conspiring to corrupt it. "Your Honor," the prosecutor addressed Judge Anderson, "the government has established not just individual acts of corruption, but a systematic effort to undermine the very foundations of justice in the city." The defense attorneys attempted to argue procedural points, challenging the evidence on technical grounds. But the weight of proof was insurmountable. Years of meticulous documentation by Lisa Carter, combined with Eleanor's testimony and Callahan's own records, painted an undeniable picture of corruption. The jury deliberation was surprisingly brief. After just 6 hours, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom hushed as the foreman stood. In the matter of the United States versus Callahan, on the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color law, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued. Guilty on racketeering, guilty on obstruction of justice, guilty on witness tampering, count after count. The jury condemned not just Callahan's actions, but the entire system he had helped create. Mayor Kensington was next. His trial revealed just how deeply the corruption had run. Evidence showed him receiving kickbacks from every major city contract, rigging bids to favor donors, and using seized assets to fund his lavish lifestyle. The mayor's arrogance ultimately led to his downfall. He had kept detailed records of every bribe, every favor, every illegal deal. Those records, discovered in a hidden room in his mansion, now provided prosecutors with a roadmap of corruption. Judge Whitaker's fate was sealed by his own words. Surveillance footage from his chambers showed him openly discussing fixed cases, coaching officers on how to write reports that would withstand scrutiny, and arranging for evidence to disappear. The judge received a particularly harsh sentence, life in prison with no possibility of parole. The justice system he had corrupted now ensured he would never experience freedom again. However, the trials were not merely about punishment. Each proceeding revealed more about how the corrupt system had functioned, how it had targeted the vulnerable and protected itself. This knowledge was already being utilized to draft new policies, new oversight measures, and new protections. Malcolm Davis stood in his office, watching as federal agents led another group of arrested officials into the courthouse. His mother sat nearby, reading letters from citizens sharing their own stories of abuse and injustice. "This is bigger than we initially thought," he said, reviewing the latest reports. "The pattern we found here isn't unique to the city." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Systems of power protect themselves. Son, what we've accomplished here has shown that they are not invincible." The reform efforts were already underway. Policy changes were drafted to require independent monitoring of body camera footage, and civilian oversight boards were established with real power to investigate complaints. Asset forfeiture laws were rewritten to prevent abuse. Perhaps the most significant change was in the public's consciousness. People who had once accepted police misconduct as inevitable were now demanding accountability. Communities that had lived in fear of corrupt officers began to organize, document, and speak out. Jordan Carter, his bruises now healed, became a symbol of this new era. His testimony regarding police brutality, combined with the evidence of corruption, sparked nationwide conversations about justice reform. "They thought they could silence us with fear," he told reporters outside the courthouse. "But fear only works when you're alone. Together, we are stronger than their corruption." Lisa Carter's role as a whistleblower inspired other officers across the nation to come forward. Her meticulous documentation of corruption became a model for other investigations, demonstrating how systematic abuse could be exposed and dismantled. The final phase of the trials focused on the broader conspiracy: the business leaders who profited from corruption, the politicians who protected it, and the officials who enabled it. Each proceeding unveiled more connections, more crimes, and more abuses of power. Richard Hamilton, the real estate developer, was convicted of bribing officials to overlook building code violations. William Foster, the banking executive, was charged with laundering money from a protection racket. One by one, the powerful figures who believed themselves untouchable faced justice. In his cell, Callahan watched news coverage of the ongoing investigations. The system he had helped construct, the power structure he thought impregnable, was being dismantled piece by piece. His attempt to flee had only added years to his sentence. The former chief had one last meeting with federal prosecutors. His lawyer had arranged it, hoping for some last-minute leniency. However, Callahan's words revealed no remorse. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "The system will protect itself. Always does." Malcolm, sitting across from him, shook his head. "No, Chief. What you're witnessing is the system correcting itself. The same laws you abused are now being used to bring you to justice." The prosecution's closing argument in Callahan's final appeal became a defining moment. The prosecutor, standing before the appeals court, spoke not just about specific crimes, but about the fundamental betrayal of public trust. The defendants didn't just break laws, she argued. They corrupted the very institutions meant to uphold them. They didn't merely steal money or abuse power. They stole people's faith in justice itself. The appeals court's decision was unanimous. Every conviction was upheld and every sentence confirmed. The corrupt officials who had once ruled the city through fear and manipulation would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. As news of the decision spread, spontaneous celebrations erupted across the city. People gathered in streets and parks, sharing stories of survival, resistance, and finally witnessing justice served. Eleanor Davis watched the celebrations from her son's office, her teacher's heart swelling with pride at the lesson her city had learned. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be changed. Justice wasn't inevitable, but it was possible. "What happens now?" Malcolm asked, standing beside her. Eleanor smiled, the same smile that had encouraged generations of students to believe in their own power. "Now the real work begins. Creating change is harder than exposing corruption, but we've demonstrated that it can be achieved." Outside, the sun was setting on a city transformed, not just by the removal of corrupt officials, but by the awakening of its citizens. People who had once felt powerless now understood their collective strength. The storm Eleanor had promised had done more than merely destroy the old order. It had cleared the way for something new, something better, and she, along with countless others, would ensure that this new beginning would not be squandered. Justice had finally arrived, and it would not be denied. 6 months after the verdicts, Eleanor Davis walked slowly down Adams Street, retracing the same route that had led her to Thompson's Market on that fateful day. The neighborhood had changed, not just physically, but in spirit. Where there had once been tension and fear in the air, now there was a sense of renewed hope and community. Eleanor paused outside the market, now sporting a sign that read, "Under new management." The ownership sign glimmered in the morning sunlight, and through the window, she observed a diverse array of customers shopping freely, devoid of the wary glances that had once been so prevalent. A young clerk, Mrs. Davis, one of her former students from years past, waved cheerfully through the glass. The warm greeting elicited smiles from other shoppers who recognized her. Eleanor had become something of a local legend, and she wore the attention with characteristic grace. "The neighborhood feels different now," remarked Sarah Williams, Malcolm's chief of staff, who frequently accompanied Eleanor on these walks. "It feels more vibrant. People can breathe easier when they're not living in fear," Eleanor replied, adjusting her pearl necklace, the same one she had worn during her arrest. It had become a symbol of resilience for many within the community. The changes extended far beyond the single street. Precinct 18 had been permanently shuttered, its building transformed into a community center dedicated to civil rights education and police accountability. The very rooms where corrupt officers had once schemed now hosted workshops focused on knowing one's rights and community organizing. Lisa Carter had emerged as a key figure in the ongoing reform initiatives. Her testimony had triggered investigations in other cities, and she now led a new police integrity unit, training officers on ethical policing and helping to establish accountability measures. The old system was built on fear, Lisa explained to a group of rookie officers during a training session. "Our new approach is constructed on trust and transparency." Her words carried significant weight, since everyone was aware of the price she had paid for standing up against corruption. The evidence room, where she had once secretly gathered proof of wrongdoing, was now a public meeting space where community members could attend monthly oversight meetings, reviewing body camera footage and police reports alongside civilian advisors. Jordan Carter's life had taken an unexpected turn. The journalism scholarship he'd received, funded by C's assets from the corrupt officials, had provided him with a platform to continue exposing injustices. His first major article, published in the city's leading newspaper, detailed the human cost of police corruption through the narratives of its victims. "Your courage initiated all this," he told Eleanor during an interview for his latest piece. "When you refused to be silenced, you demonstrated to others that they could speak up as well." Eleanor's response reflected her lifelong role as a teacher. "Courage is contagious, Jordan. Sometimes people just need to witness it in action to recognize it within themselves." The impact of the case reverberated through the justice system. Judge Anderson, who had presided over many of the corruption trials, now led a commission on judicial reform. Her first action was to establish new guidelines for handling police misconduct cases, ensuring they could not be buried or dismissed without thorough examination. "The corruption we uncovered wasn't merely about individuals breaking laws," she explained during a public hearing. "It was about a system that had lost its way. Our reforms must address both." In federal prison, former Chief Callahan watched these changes unfold on the news. His power, once seemingly absolute, had completely disintegrated. The officers who had once fearfully obeyed his orders were now testifying against him in ongoing investigations. Mayor Kensington's downfall had been particularly dramatic, his carefully cultivated image as a civic leader shattered under the weight of evidence. The offshore accounts that Eleanor had first heard mentioned in her holding cell-led investigators to hundreds of millions in misappropriated public funds. The recovery of those funds brought unexpected benefits to the community. Under federal oversight, the money was redirected toward its intended purposes: community programs, educational initiatives, and infrastructure improvements in neighborhoods that had suffered the most under the corrupt regime. Judge Whitaker's fate served as a powerful warning to others who might contemplate abusing their authority. He died in prison 3 months into his sentence, leaving behind a legacy not of judicial wisdom, but rather of corruption and betrayal. His death garnered headlines, yet few mourned his passing. The reform movement that Eleanor had ignited spread beyond the city limits. Other communities, inspired by her example, began scrutinizing their own power structures. Police departments across the nation faced increased scrutiny, and civilian oversight boards gained genuine authority. Malcolm Davis, despite receiving offers for higher positions, including a Supreme Court nomination, chose to continue his work at the grassroots level. He established a special task force dedicated to investigating systemic corruption within law enforcement. "What we learned from my mother's case," he explained to his team, "is that corruption doesn't simply happen. It's permitted to occur when people look the other way. Our job is to keep looking, keep questioning, and keep demanding accountability." Eleanor's influence was felt in unexpected ways. Law schools began incorporating her case into their ethics courses, while police departments integrated lessons learned from the investigation into their training programs. Community organizations developed new strategies for documenting and challenging abuses of power. The former evidence locker, where she had overheard officers plotting corruption, now housed a civil rights library. Photos documenting the community's struggle for justice adorned its walls, including one of Eleanor standing dignified in handcuffs, her head held high. Detective Lisa Carter's role as a whistleblower inspired others to come forward. A network of police integrity officers formed across the country, sharing information and strategies for identifying and preventing corruption. Her meticulous documentation methods became a model for internal affairs departments nationwide. "What Eleanor Davis taught us," Lisa often reiterated in her training sessions, "is that the most powerful weapon against corruption is the truth, not hidden, not whispered, but spoken openly and backed with evidence." The changes weren't solely institutional. Community attitudes shifted as people recognized their power to demand accountability. Neighborhood watch groups evolved into civilian oversight committees, while local businesses that had once paid protection money now contributed to community improvement funds. Jordan Carter's journalism career flourished as he continued investigating systemic injustices. His articles exposed similar patterns of corruption in other cities, leading to further investigations and reforms. The scholarship program established in his honor helped aspiring young journalists focus on investigative reporting. "Every story matters," he told his fellow reporters. "Every voice deserves to be heard." That's what Mrs. Davis demonstrated when she refused to be silenced. The community center that replaced Precinct 18 became a model for similar transformations across the country. Its programs focused not only on civil rights education, but also on building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they served. Officer Sarah Turner, who had once challenged Lisa Carter's decision to expose corruption, now led training sessions on ethical policing. Her perspective had shifted dramatically after witnessing the positive changes that reform had brought to the community. "We were mistaken," she admitted during a public forum. "We thought power meant control, but real power comes from trust, from serving the community, not dominating it." Eleanor's pearl necklace, which had been lost in evidence during her arrest, became a symbol of resistance against injustice. Local artists incorporated its image into murals celebrating community resilience, and young activists wore pearl necklaces at demonstrations to honor her legacy of dignified resistance. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some officers resigned rather than adapt to the new accountability measures, while others resisted reforms, claiming they would render policing more dangerous. However, the evidence indicated otherwise. Community trust led to improved cooperation and safer conditions for both officers and citizens. Malcolm's decision to decline the Supreme Court nomination surprised many, but not those who knew him best. "Real change," he explained, "happens in communities, not just courtrooms. My mother taught me that justice is built from the ground up." The federal investigation she had initiated continued to uncover connections to corruption in other cities. Each new revelation led to more reforms, increased accountability, and further change. The storm Eleanor had promised had evolved into a nationwide movement for justice. Former Officer Mitchell, serving his sentence in federal prison, finally expressed remorse during a restorative justice session. "We thought we were above the law," he admitted. "Mrs. Davis showed us that no one is untouchable when people unite for justice." The documentation of Eleanor's case became required reading in civil rights courses. Law professors utilized it to illustrate how systemic corruption could be exposed and dismantled, while police academies studied it as a cautionary tale about the consequences of power abuse and the significance of ethical policing. The civilian oversight board that now monitored police activities included community members from all walks of life. Their monthly meetings, held in the former precinct building, ensured transparency and accountability in law enforcement operations. 1 year after the verdicts, Eleanor sat in her favorite rocking chair, reading a letter from Jordan Carter. His words encapsulated the impact of her courage. "You changed my life, Mrs. Davis, and now I'll dedicate mine to changing others. Your lesson wasn't just about standing up to corruption. It was about believing in the power of truth to transform communities." She smiled, reminiscing about all the students she had taught over 40 years in the classroom. This final lesson about justice, courage, and the power of standing firm against corruption might have been her most significant. The community continued to heal and grow stronger. New businesses opened in storefronts that had once paid protection money, and community gardens blossomed in vacant lots that had been neglected under the corrupt regime. People gathered freely on streets that had once been zones of fear. Lisa Carter's police integrity unit became a national model. Departments across the country sent officers to learn from her experiences. The detailed records she had maintained during the corruption investigation were studied as examples of how to document and expose systematic abuses of power. The seized assets from corrupt officials continued to fund community enhancements. Parks were renovated. Schools received new resources, and youth programs thrived. The money that had once enriched corrupt officials now served the people it was meant to benefit. Eleanor's influence extended beyond her immediate community. Civil rights organizations examined her case as a model of how one person's courage could catalyze systemic change. Her strategy of careful observation and documentation became a template for challenging institutional corruption. The final scene of her victory played out quietly, without fanfare. Eleanor Davis sat in her rocking chair, watching the sunset through her window. On her lap lay Jordan's letter, and around her neck, the pearl necklace caught the fading light. She reflected on all that had changed. The corrupt system dismantled, the community transformed, and the legacy of fear replaced with hope. But more importantly, she considered what remained constant: the power of truth, the importance of courage, and the endless work of building justice. The fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. Yet Eleanor Davis had demonstrated that victory was possible, that systems could be altered, and that justice could prevail. Her story would continue to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and demand accountability. As darkness fell, she smiled, knowing that somewhere in the city, someone else was finding the courage to stand up for what was right. The storm she had promised had fulfilled its purpose, clearing the way for something new to flourish, and in that growth lay the true measure of her victory. How many Eleanor Davises are out there right now, silently witnessing corruption unfold, gathering evidence, and waiting for their moment to speak truth to power? How many systems still require exposure? The battle for justice never truly ends. It merely finds new warriors to fight it. Like and subscribe to join us for more incredible true stories of courage and transformation. Hit that notification bell to be part of our growing community of justice seekers.